Today I'm speaking with Dr. Wayne Grody. Dr. Grody is a professor in the departments of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine, Pediatrics, and Human Genetics at the UCLA School of Medicine, as well as the director and founder of its Diagnostic Molecular Pathology Laboratories. He's an international expert in genomics, but maintains an interest in cosmology, astrophysics, and even futurism. In this conversation, we discuss what is genomics, the plausibility of predictive healthcare using genetic technology, the science and bioethics of embryonic screening and in vitro fertilization, the promises and perils of genetic engineering, the future of humanity, why we, the students of today, are the most important generation for the survival of our civilization, the existence of extraterrestrial societies, the wonders of the scientific method, and the beauty of wide-ranging curiosity. In this episode, you will peer into the mind of one of UCLA's top doctors and geneticists and discover a conversation that you'd be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. So, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Wayne Grody. You're listening to the Elder Lama podcast, the show that inspires curious minds to ponder the secrets of the universe. My name is Erica Mezqua. I'm a UCLA undergrad STEM major, and in this podcast, I combine my knowledge of astrophysics, evolutionary biology, and the nature of the human mind to make cohesive observations about the world. I'm here with Dr. Wayne Grody. Dr. Grody, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
So you are a man of many hats. If one were to go on the UCLA faculty website and look up your name, they would be faced with a long list of titles and accomplishments. It seems like you have a foot in everything genetics that goes on at UCLA, which I think will make for a really fascinating conversation. I hope to go into topics like genetic engineering. We can talk about genomics, of course. But first, maybe we can start off by you summarizing what it is that you do professionally.
Yeah, well, Eric, you're right. I do have a pretty diverse and broad career at UCLA. I love it. I'm not sure it's the greatest role model for all of your listeners because as we were talking before we went on the air, just you and me, to really succeed in an academic career, they always say, focus, focus, focus. That you got to not try to be an expert in everything. But hone in on, what really interests you. It might be a tiny little system or subspecialty, the genetics of some parasite or bacteria, and just become, the international expert at that. My interests, like yours, have always been so broad that I've had a hard time doing that. Luckily, I've still had a successful career, but it's not that easy. So, just quickly for your listeners, I decided to get a combined MD PhD when I went to medical school. So it takes 8 years instead of 4 years. And that was because of what I just said. Even there, I couldn't focus on only clinical medicine or only research. I thought I'd get bored. Not bored isn't the right word, but just tired of doing only one without the other. And when I went to med school, I won't tell you how long ago it was. I think it was the second year that those programs were being offered by a few medical schools. And I only applied to med schools that offered both. So I've never regretted it. And so I don't even have a typical day at UCLA. If you were to follow me around, some days it would be mostly in the research lab, other days in the clinical lab, other days in the genetics clinic, seeing patients, teaching medical students, depending which quarter. We're on the quarter system, and the first quarter, I do a ton of teaching to our first year med students. I run their genetics course. So it really varies. And then, I run the DNA diagnostic lab at UCLA, which I started about 33 years ago. And it was one of the first labs of its kind. So we got out in front, which was kind of nice. It was not that I'm any smarter than anyone else, but we just started earlier. And because of that, I got appointed to a lot of government and professional committees looking into the ethics of genetic testing, insurance discrimination, gene patents, So I still do a lot of work at the national and even international level that way. So I love all these things. I wouldn't call it very focused. And I probably work about 18 hours a day, including weekends. So again, I'm not saying that I'm the greatest role model, but that's sort of a little thumbnail of what I do.
And we were talking before we got on the air that it's pretty fascinating that at a campus like UCLA, we can have a conversation like this. You just kind of listed out what everything you're doing at UCLA, and you're an accomplished expert already. You have years working in your career, and you're pretty well known. And for me to be able to, me as an undergrad, to be able to have a conversation with you, and for us to both be able to learn something, I think that's really what makes UCLA special. And it's a really privileged position to be in. So I just want to start off by saying thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, and as we did talk, even when we first met, and of course, during this quarter and by email preparing for this, I expressed the exact same thing that, I know you have undergrads from not just UCLA in your audience, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So I believe me, I'm not meaning this to be an ad for UCLA, especially for high school students who may be listening, because we already get more applicants than any other college in the country. If you want to be add to the 120,000 applications they get every year, good luck. My own son didn't get into UCLA, and I've been on the faculty for 33 years. But one reason I've never left UCLA, even though I've had offers, I love the way the whole campus, all the different schools, medical school, graduate schools, undergraduate, what they call the college, liberal arts, the law school, they're all on the same campus. And so it's wonderful for interdisciplinary collaboration. I love interacting with undergrads, even though most of my organized teaching is in the medical school for med students, both in the classroom and on the wards. I've always welcomed undergrads. I've had them in my research lab. They're brilliant. They're every bit as good as my graduate students. They've ended up on papers, even being first author on papers. Even in a more casual way, I love meeting people like you who have unusual interests and backgrounds and talking about potential future careers. So that's one of the beauties of UCLA. If you think of other first tier medical schools, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, they're usually the med school is across town in a whole other part of the city from the undergrad campus. Some med schools are literally in another city from the undergrad, and they're great medical schools, but I think they lose a certain little extra bonus that we get here at UCLA. So I would never turn away an undergrad. I also get a lot of inquiries from high school students, both locally and elsewhere, and that, as much as I'd like to help, I don't really have time. I feel I owe whatever free time I have to UCLA trainees.
Great. Yeah, I would agree with that. It seems like when all of the departments, all the schools are in one area, you don't lose brain power, or you don't lose like the this energetic hotspot. There's kind of a principle of ecology to pull from here. In ecology, when we're trying to do conservation, it's better to have like one big area of land rather than a bunch of separate small ones, because in this way we have more stable and diverse ecosystems. So I think we have a similar thing here where you walk around UCLA and you're interacting with med students and law students and undergraduates all in the same area. So I think you see this kind of this energetic hotspot of brain power, as we said earlier. So it's kind of my goal to extract as much value as I can from them in my year and a half left here, and share it to the world. You are an expert in genomics, so I think we will start there. Can you explain from your perspective what is genomics, and should the layperson care about it? Why should we care about genomics?
Sure. And let me put it in historical context for you, because genomics is, at least in my career, a relatively new word on the playing field. Genetics, of course, goes way, way back. Um, Probably clinical genetics, as a specialty or it actually started as a subspecialty of pediatrics, and now it's considered its own specialty as of 1990. Probably was at least recognized as a subspecialty, I don't know, since the 1930s, 20s, something like that. Um, and, genetics, Mendel was sort of the father of how we understand how genes are inherited, even though he never used the word gene. Um, so it's been around a long time. Genomics is more recent. So, you know, genetics is sort of the study of traits and diseases that are inherited. And for most of my career, I've paid attention to disorders in my clinical lab, that we could test for using DNA probes, that were well understood to be caused by mutations in a single gene, like sickle cell disease, Huntington's, chorea, uh, what would be some others, cystic fibrosis. We understand those pretty well, and it's a matter of just looking at that one gene and looking for the mutation or mutations that might be there. Um, then around 2008, 2009, a new technology came on the scene for sequencing genes. That's reading every letter of the genetic code, what we call the nucleotides, A, C, G, and T. And it was much faster and cheaper than the older methods of DNA sequencing. People call it next generation sequencing. And it, for the first time, allowed us in a practical way to examine not just one gene, like the cystic fibrosis gene, that we think may be defective in a certain patient, but all the genes, of which there's about 22,000 of them. The sum total of all those genes plus all the what we call non-coding DNA that's in between them makes up your genome. And it's about, in a human cell, 6.6 billion of these letters or nucleotides long. That would have been completely impossible to examine in any one person uh, in any practical time. I mean, the Human Genome Project, which was looking at one person, took 13 years to finish using the old methods of DNA sequencing. That could never have been a clinical test. Now we can turn it around in, a few days. The interpretation is very complicated, but the technology has gotten much faster and cheaper. So that's the area that I call clinical genomics. It's looking at all the genes and even outside the genes in the DNA of a patient. Now, why would we do that? It would be because we have a patient with some weird disorder that doesn't fit clinically anything we know about. So they are undiagnosed and they go on that way for years or even decades. Unlike a patient, a baby who has lung disease, lung infections all the time, it looks to us like cystic fibrosis. We'll find the mutations in that gene. If they have symptoms and signs that are kind of don't fit any known syndrome, that's when they get referred to our clinical genomics center. And we will do the genome sequencing, which is looking at all the genes. So that's how I define it from the clinical point of view. That the actual term genomics or genome, the genome is essentially all of the DNA, all of the genes in our cells of any organism. For me, I work with humans, but could be mice, it could be E. coli bacteria, anything like that.
At the moment, our healthcare seems to be kind of reactive in that somebody gets sick and then they go to the hospital and the doctor tries to see what's going on with the body. But I've heard that with this technology of being able to sequence the entire genome quite easily, as you said, we might start shifting towards a more predictive healthcare in that at birth, infants can be screened. They're already being screened, in fact, for a bunch of diseases, but it's just going to become more and more common for all newborns to have their entire genome sequenced, and then us being able to perhaps predict potential diseases. How plausible is that? And do you see that happening soon?
Yeah, great. Those are the $1 million questions you just asked. Yeah, as soon as it became practical to look at all the genes of a person in a reasonable amount of time and cost. That was the first question that popped into everyone's mind. Instead of only using it now for patients who are symptomatic, really ill, and we're trying to find out which gene is causing it, if any. Remember, not everything is genetic. Some things are just environmental and stuff like that, like lung cancer from smoking, although there's still a genetic component because, many smokers never get lung cancer. So how come they survive? But you're exactly right. Unlike a patient who comes in symptomatic, and if it fits a known disease, we just will look at that one gene, like cystic fibrosis. If it doesn't fit, we'll look at all of them, but we're matching it to their symptoms and signs, what we in genetics call the phenotype. The promise now that you can look at all the genes was, well, why wait for them to get sick? Let's just do it as early in life as possible. And newborn is being talked about, as you just said, assuming it's a healthy newborn, which most of them are. Why don't we just sequence their whole genome on day one of life, store it in the electronic medical record, which we can't do now, but hopefully Bill Gates or someone will help us do that. It's actually too much memory to fit into our EMR at the moment. And then, as you said, if we find some variants or mutations in genes that we know will increase their risk of coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis, we could advise them to follow some lifestyles that would be more healthy. And of course, if you started in young children, it's a lot easier to stick to that. Getting adults to be healthy is almost impossible, I'm afraid to say. But yeah, that's sort of the goal. The problem is our knowledge of those common diseases and what causes them is still in its infancy. These are what are called multifactorial polygenic disorders: diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, autism, schizophrenia. We don't actually know for sure all the genes that cause those. So the genome sequence is not going to be all that predictive right away. Second, someone has to pay for the testing, which at the moment still costs, at least $2,000 or $3,000. That would be hard to do on every newborn or even every adult. But you're right, it's being talked about. Obviously, preventive medicine, throughout all of medicine, prevention is much cheaper and much more pleasant for the patient than treating them after they get sick. This goes for heart disease. If you can spare them open heart surgery, cancer, it would be much better to prevent the breast cancer rather than do the, double mastectomy and whatever else they need if it's metastatic. It's just getting that going has not been easy in any area of medicine, and same with genomics.
I see. In one of my society and genetics courses right now, with the one you actually gave a guest lecture at recently where we first met, we just covered the topic of genetic determinism and pretty much just showed all the reasons why it's faulty. It's not how genes work, and that's kind of what you hinted at as well. That yes, we have these blueprints, and even if we were to be able to completely interpret them well, there's still so many other factors at play. It's not just the genes; it's the environment and some other random factors. I imagine there's a big debate about like whether we should screen all newborns or not. One argument I can think of against it is the idea that if you have a newborn who is genetically predisposed for some disease, and you raise it its whole life believing, oh yeah, you're gonna have this disease, we have to prepare you now. That's a great way to just like get that into their minds and ensure that it happens. As we know, the mind has an effect on the physiology. We look at the placebo effect. Patients given a fake drug, or not even a drug, just a sugar pill, for instance, and they think it's an actual medicine, they will experience the corresponding physiological change in them, as if they were actually as if they actually took the medicine. So I think here, if an infant is raised believing that he has this disease, then it's very possible that this could affect the actual expression of the disease.
Oh, beautifully stated. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I agree completely with you. It's why I am at the moment subject to change. I want to have an open mind, but at the moment, I too am again. I'm disinclined. Let's put it politically nicely to endorse universal newborn genomic sequencing, and it's largely for that reason. We actually have a strong rule in just regular genetics where we, the single gene tests, which now seem so simple to us. They weren't always. We have a pretty strict rule. We won't do any of those on anyone under the age of 18. So it's not just newborns, anyone who's not legally an adult. They're below the age of consent. And it's mainly the reason you said. If they're healthy at the time of testing, then it becomes a predictive test. And you're not going to, in many of these things, there's no medical treatment you would start until the symptoms begin. Not all diseases are like that, but many are. So all you're going to do is label them with this horrible thing. It could even be a death sentence if it's a fatal disease, like Huntington's disease. You could potentially just ruin their life for no benefit at all. Once they turn 18, they can have it if they want. Even then, if it's a later onset disease, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it immediately. But yeah, so we already have a precedent of not doing predictive genetic testing for adult onset diseases on healthy children. It's different, of course, if there's a strong family history of something, meaning that baby's now at much higher risk than the average baby. But I'm just talking about universal screening, which is what you asked about. And so I would be against it for that reason. And a lot of it is what you said. It's the psychological impact, both from the individual once they're told, a newborn won't understand it, but once their parents divulge to them, which I hope they wouldn't do for a long time, but suppose they said to a 7-year-old, "Oh, by the way, we've known ever since you were born, you're going to have this horrible neurologic disease in about 20 years or something." What's that going to do to the child, especially if there's no way to prevent it? So, and some of it's even more subtle than that. And we've seen this, believe me, even in the single gene tests, like Huntington's, it's a dominant disease. So there's a 50-50 risk for each pregnancy to have an affected patient. The symptoms don't start usually till middle age. We've found that when several siblings are tested at once, and we try to avoid it in children, but for the reason I just said, the parents will, let's say one child has the Huntington mutation, one doesn't. Even if the parents don't inform them of that, subliminally, they may put aside money for college only for the one who's, going to live the long life. They may subconsciously think, why do I want to invest in this? He's going to have dementia. That's part of this disease, starting at age 40 and just going downhill from there. So it's a form of genetic discrimination, even by the parents, even if they don't know they're doing it. So these are many important reasons why we don't like to label healthy children with some future disease, unless there's a medical intervention that you would do that the genetic test would help. And there are some diseases have that, but many do not.
It's interesting how rapidly we get into social implications, and like we were just talking about, all the way to the scale of nucleotides, and now we're looking at its greater implications for society. It's fascinating how we just got into bioethics like that. Okay, some other thing I'd like to talk about. Right now, we have the technology to genetically screen embryos and see what genetic diseases they might be predisposed to. And through in vitro fertilization, we can actually choose which of these embryos, the healthy embryo, to actually develop into a child. And I've read that this might be the end of, or this soon might be the end of sexual reproduction for humans. In that, the idea is that why would you risk having a child through sexual reproduction if you can totally guarantee that by having it through in vitro fertilization, that the child will not be born with some horrible genetic disease. So I wonder what you think about that. And I know that this bioethicist at NYU, um, I don't remember his name right now, but this is actually something he said, that sexual reproduction will be one day be a thing of the past. Humans will still, of course, they will still engage in sexual behavior, but they will not. It will not be the primary means of procreation.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, there have been famous books like this about that, like Brave New World comes to mind. It was done for slightly different reasons. Yeah, it's possible. I think we're talking about the way, way distant future, if ever. The ethical issues of this are, huge. All the possible abuses that could happen, and especially under a fascist type government who would determine, which embryos are allowed to get born, and it may go beyond just, the ones without a disease gene. It could be only the ones of a certain race. That the potential for abuse is huge. Fortunately, that's not going to happen today or tomorrow. For one thing, the technique you talked about, which I'll define for your listeners because they're not all in the course you're taking where it was defined, is very expensive. It usually requires about $20,000 of out-of-pocket cost by the parent, the couple, because insurance won't pay for it. Secondly, it's being used to just avoid implanting an embryo in the mother's uterus that has the known disease mutation in it for a single gene. It's not for polygenic traits like intelligence or blonde hair or things like that, or even avoiding the polygenic diseases like heart disease or psychosis. I wish we knew how to do that. We're nowhere near it. So it's only being done now for known single gene defects for which there's already a family history. Usually in the form of an affected child they've already had by a natural pregnancy. So what they can do, you can have another pregnancy and then do prenatal testing by the routine way, which is amniocentesis, sticking a needle in the pregnant mother's uterus and withdrawing some of the amniotic fluid, which has fetal cells in it, doing the single gene test, which we do in my lab all the time on that. And if by bad luck the fetus is shown to have the mutation or mutations in question, the couple has the option to terminate the pregnancy. And here, of course, you get into all the ethics of abortion, which I think your audience well knows what's going on there. But this is a legal procedure, and it's done a lot in prenatal genetics settings. If you do have a couple that, for religious or other reasons, wouldn't want to do a pregnancy with termination, and if they have the money, they can opt for the technique you just mentioned, which is first they do an in vitro fertilization, IVF, where you harvest. Believe me, it's not easy. That's why this costs a lot of money. An obstetrician has to administer a drug to the prospective mother to make her ovaries release more oocytes, eggs, than normal. And then those are harvested, usually by laparoscopy, a tube that's put in. And then, of course, getting sperm from the man is pretty easy. And then, you fertilize the sperm and the eggs in dishes in the lab, which you hope each one will have one embryo in it. And then it's possible with our modern molecular genetic techniques to do a single cell biopsy from the 8-cell embryo without damaging the future baby, and do your genetic test on that. And let's say it's a dominant disease like Huntington's, and we've done this before. Roughly half the embryos will have the mutation, half will not. You just implant 2 or 3 of the embryos that did not have the genetic mutation in it. And if you've done it right, there would be no need for amniocentesis or pregnancy termination. Your idea, or this ethicist, is, well, everyone, I don't know how many pregnancies there are in the country every year. I think there's 3 million just in California alone. Are all of those going to do IVF and then this pre-implantation genetic diagnosis that I described, PGD, at $20,000 a pop? which most of them couldn't begin to pay out of pocket. So is the government going to pay? I don't think so. And also, what are we going to look for? Most of these have no family history of a single gene disorder. And I actually don't know how to determine that someone's going to get high blood pressure. That's probably due to 5,000 genes, each one of which has a little incremental effect. But if enough of them are mutated altogether, it raises your risk. And it's going to still be far from 100%. And it's treatable. That one is. So I don't see anything that would compel people or governments to want to do this, at least anytime soon. Sorry for the long answer.
That was fantastic. There seems to be a large discrepancy between how this actually works, as you just described, and what the public thinks about it. Like, as soon as you started what you were saying, you mentioned that you can't you can't choose like polygenic traits like intelligence or blonde hair, but it seems like everyone thinks that is the case, that you're going to be able to choose a baby and select all of the great attributes that you want in your baby. I actually was even reading this book called Hacking Darwin by Jamie Metzel. It's a popular science book, but I was just skimming through it actually earlier, and I got to this chart of a bunch of attributes that we might be able to choose in future babies, and among them were intelligence, great skill in mathematics, and a bunch of other things that, as you mentioned, they're not determined by single genes. They're this incredibly complex interaction between multiple genes and the environment and some other random variation. So it's quite interesting that we could stray that far. How does that happen? Do you think we the science community knows that it's not the case that we can do that, or at least not right now, and yet the public consciousness is convinced that we're going to see designer babies in the future?
Yeah, it's a real problem. I don't know what's to blame, if it's a problem in our general educational system that people in high school are not getting sufficient science background, or in the popular media, they're not giving the stories the proper slant. Uh, Hollywood could be part of the problem because everyone's seen so many science fiction movies about human cloning and, developing supermen or subhuman men that, can just do manual labor. And of course, that's all science fiction. We wouldn't begin to know how to do that yet. And even if we did, there'd be all kinds of ethical things against it. Look what happened already in China when that guy did the genetic editing, using the CRISPR technology of the two female embryos, and they were brought to term, first in the world, and now the guy's in jail. And that's China, where they probably don't really have that many rules against it, but there was such an international outcry. So to start doing that more universally, especially when we don't even know the gene targets, I think it's pure science fiction. But you're right, the general public just doesn't know, and so they're fearful of it. I wish they also knew that it's a form of, you're also tempting fate. Even if we did know that stuff, like, the 2,000 genes that help for intelligence, I don't even know. It could be 20,000 genes. I don't know. And we knew what the mutations were and everything, which believe me, we won't know that for at least another 100 years. Let's say we did. There's still going to be so much in the human genome we don't know. So, some family will do the IVF PGD, pick and choose 2 embryos from the 6 that were made, because those looked like they had the best combination of intelligence genes or tallness genes, whatever you're looking for, only to be surprised that there was an autism gene that no one ever heard of, that they ended up in the 2 embryos they chose that maybe weren't in the others. It's all luck. And, that baby is going to be, handicapped their whole life, or some kind of fatal pediatric cancer. We don't know all the genes for those yet. So even by trying to pick and choose, there's so many hidden things that you're now artificially choosing for that may not have happened in a natural pregnancy. I feel you're kind of tempting fate, and maybe that's just my view. I don't like to tempt fate. I'm all for interventions for preventing disease if you know what you're preventing, but in this case, we really don't.
Okay, so I guess on that note, and I think I asked you this actually in your guest lecture at the end of it. We've been evolving a certain way since the dawn of life on Earth. That is through random mutation, and then there's natural selection, and gradually there are changes in the gene pool. But it seems like now we're getting to a point where those changes in the gene pool are within the power of humanity, right? We're getting into genetic engineering and CRISPR. These are things that allow us to change the genome now. Uh, and we've made it clear that we made it clear that the promises of all these genetic advancements, they're not as clear cut or as promising as as we think they are. But where do you see it going? You're in a position where you probably know more about this than the top 0.1% of the world. So while humans are pretty bad at predicting the future, I think you're better off. Um, where do you see this genetic advancement leading our species in the next 100,000, 100, 200, 500, 1,000 years? And what promises and what perils do you actually see happening?
Yeah, great question. I have thought a lot about it. I appreciate your compliment, but I haven't been that great a predictor either. I often joke with my colleagues that when the Human Genome Project started in 1990 at a budget of $3 billion, I actually thought it was a waste of money. Why would you ever need to know the sequence of 6 billion nucleotides? Turned out now my whole career, the last 10 years, has been occurred only because of that. When AIDS started, and that was when I first got to UCLA, we didn't even know it was infectious at the time. Um, and then it was identified as a retrovirus. The only known retroviruses were in birds up to that time. It was called Rouse sarcoma virus. I couldn't believe there was a human retrovirus, meaning, it's an RNA genome of the virus that then gets copied into DNA. So I was proven wrong about that. And there have been other examples like that too. So I don't know if you want to use me to bet on the Super Bowl, but I have given a lot of thought to what you just said. Can humans influence our own species evolution in a much faster way than regular natural evolution? You used the word, I think, slowly or something, and you're exactly right. This is another thing the lay public just do not understand. That they think something happens overnight where something is selected for, that everyone's saying, the missing link, which there is no such thing, but, between chimpanzees and us, whatever it was, that, I think they have in mind that some chimpanzee 2 million years ago gave birth to some highly mutant child that kind of looked quasi-human. And that was the start of Homo sapiens, because this child was so much smarter than the other chimps, it became dominant. These things occur over millions of years. People just don't understand. It is natural selection, but it's not like a lightning bolt. And there's a lot of dead ends. Could humans start influencing that? Yes. For the common complex diseases we've talked about, like diabetes, we don't have the knowledge yet to change all those genes. Could we eliminate certain dominant disorders like Huntington's disease? Yes, we could, but we could do that even now without any fancy genome sequencing or gene editing. If every family with a history of Huntington's disease, it just said, we're not going to have any more children, that would eliminate it. Of course, that you could never do that, and they'd never want to. We could do prenatal testing for Huntington's, and if every family terminated every affected fetus, that would end it. But again, that's not going to happen. There's already aspects of human evolution we've influenced. I hope you won't find this an insult, but we're on video now, I see you're wearing glasses. They don't look particularly thick, so I don't know what degree of myopia or what else, whatever you have. But let if you had been born 20,000 years ago, you may not have made it if you had really bad eyesight. You would probably gotten eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or something. So simply by correcting eyesight, vision with glasses, whenever that started, I don't know when it was, that influenced human evolution and the gene pool. Because people with myopia, which I don't think we even know what causes it, it's probably partly luck and partly some genes we don't know. Those would have been probably eliminated from the gene pool a while ago, but now there's no selective pressure against them as long as you're in a semi-industrialized country that can make glasses for you. Look what we've done with breeds of dogs without any genetic engineering at all. You have Chihuahuas and you have Great Danes and everything in between simply by selective breeding. Now, the Nazis tried to do selective breeding with humans and they almost got away with it along with genocide. You could do that. I've often wondered, could there be so much variation in humans as there are in dogs? Theoretically, I guess there could, but no one could ever force that degree of selective breeding that we force our dog breeds to do. It's just in humans, unless in a science fiction thing. So it probably would only happen by some sophisticated genetic engineering, gene editing. But like I say, I'm glad you gave me the year span of 500 years. We can barely predict what's going to happen 2 years from now. But assuming we don't blow ourselves up, which I think is the biggest risk by far to us, as I mentioned in class, any risk of eugenics by genetic editing is minuscule compared to the risk we're going to go extinct from either climate change or global nuclear war. And I think many societies in the universe have died off that way. Assuming we don't kill ourselves, maybe again, I don't know, but maybe in 1,000 years, we could begin to do some of this evolutionary, forcing evolution, like you've said. I hope it will be done ethically, where no one's forced into anything. I wouldn't mind eliminating diseases if we could, but as far as other traits, boy, there you get into a real slippery slope, as I told you. Even intelligence. I mean, who's to say, do you want everyone to be an Einstein? That may not be so good for the world either. So anyway, to me, it's still science fiction, but assuming our species survives, which I'm not so sure right now, but if it surprises me, and it does, for a long time, think of the time scales of the universe, 1,000, 10,000 years. People 50 years ago watching us doing this thing now on this weird little thing with a keyboard, they would be shocked. And that's just 50 years. Think about 500 years, 10,000, 1 million, a billion. What will be like then? Maybe we won't even have physical bodies then, be like that Star Trek episode where they're just these mental things floating in the universe. So I hate to make really far out future predictions. I don't think we have to worry about that anytime within our lifetimes. I think I'd be willing to bet on that.
Those time spans you said, like 10 years, we can't even predict 2 years, let alone like 1,000 or a billion. That's incredible. And just 50 years ago, a computer like this, like it would be stuff of magic, right? And so the difference in technology between 50 years ago and 50 years from now, it's not the same. We know that technology is even increasing at a faster rate. So we don't even know what's going to happen. But I'd like to run with something you briefly mentioned, which was other societies in the universe. That's something that also fascinates me, and I imagined you mentioning that's just the tip of the iceberg into what you've pondered about the universe. But that's right up my alley. I love imagining, thinking about stuff like that because, as we know, there are 100 billion galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars. So for there not to be life out there is at least highly improbable. Um, I actually wrote an audio essay in one of my first episodes of my podcast, and it was titled "We're the Most Important Generation," and it's about the idea that civilization is at a point in time where our technology is it's getting to the point where it's very powerful, and yet we are very primitive uh, in our awareness. We're still kind of unrefined primates, and we might easily blow ourselves up or kill our planet. And this point right now, like at this point where in the next 500 years technology is going to change so much, it's crucial, because what happens in the next couple decades or centuries is really going to decide the future of our civilization. Carl Sagan had, I don't know if it was Carl Sagan actually,
I know what you're going to say. The Drake equation?
the Kardashev scale. That's what it is.
Oh, I don't know that.
The Kardashev scale says that there are four types of civilizations. There are type 1 civilization, which is a civilization able to control all of the energy of its planet. We are a 0.77 civilization, according to Michio Kaku. So we're almost at that point of controlling all the energy of Earth. Then there's type 2 civilization, which can control all the energy of its sun in its solar system. And type 3 civilization, which controls all the energy of its galaxy. Okay, so we're 0.77, and this is supposed to be the most treacherous transition. The transition from being like a type 0 to type 1. Because this is the point where a civilization gains, has rapid technological advancement, and this is where it discovers nuclear weapons and genetic engineering and a bunch of these amazing technologies that have a lot of promise, but at the same time can be detrimental. So the reason I think that our generation is so crucial is because we have to be the ones who harness the power of these technologies intelligently and find humility and try not to kill ourselves. I think it's crucial that we do so, but like you said, it's kind of bleak out there, you know. It's a scary world, but I also have no doubt that this has happened many times before, all throughout the cosmos.
Yeah, and as we talked before went on the air, we're both fans of astrophysics, astronomy, astrobiology. I love science fiction. So I read a lot about this too. And yeah, you're right. I did read his book, and he did describe those three phases. I was referring, in a way, you end up with the same conclusion. The Drake equation, which I learned from Carl Sagan's Cosmos series. There's these of the chance of there being intelligent life, like in the Milky Way, let alone everywhere else. I agree with you. It's got to be virtually 100%, given how many planets there are. And that's just the known universe. There could even be an infinite number of universes. But, so one factor of it was, the distance of a planet from its sun. Is there water? Of course, that's assuming life as we know it. Maybe other other kinds of life don't need water. But, and it went on and on from that. But I remember it had about 6 or 7 elements in the equation. But the very last one was the one you were talking about. And Drake arbitrarily gave it a value of 1/2. It was the chance that the civilization will blow itself up before it ever contacts another civilization. And of course, Drake, this was decades ago, he was basing it on the most likely form of contact he knew, and Sagan too, which was radio waves and radio astronomy. And the way Sagan explained it, I never forgot it, stuck in my mind. It's pretty much what you said, but not so much harnessing the energy of the whole planet, but the average civilization, right around the time they discover radio waves and hence radio astronomy, and hence signals that they're unknowingly putting out into the universe that someone else may hear sometime. That's right around the same time they discover nuclear fission. And so there's, he gave it a 1/2 chance that they're going to blow themselves up with a nuclear war. He didn't even mention other things like climate change. But, some people have speculated, I'm sure you already know this, why haven't we contacted anyone else, or they've contacted us? I personally think it's because the distances and the times are too great. But you could also say that pessimistically, most of the intelligent civilizations that have grown up in other star systems have blown themselves up before they ever had time to do any interstellar travel. If we knew that, it would be a good lesson for us on Earth to maybe change our politics, or at least outlaw nuclear weapons. Of course, we won't know it, and there's a good chance, like you said, we'll be just one of those statistics, a pretty promising civilization that did some amazing things, but then canceled it all out in the 21st century or whatever.
I think right now we're at a point where there's a lot of skeptics of life, extraterrestrial life. But for me, it's kind of the same thing as like the Europeans think that there's no other humans outside of Europe. Like this is the Earth, right? But then, they cross the ocean and they find that there's more to it. I think we're in a similar frontier here where we think that there's nothing out there, but we really haven't explored much.
Yeah, I heard an analogy. There's the SETI, search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and I've met some of those people through other means. There's an analogy or metaphor they give now. There's essentially an infinite number of frequencies you can set your radio telescope to, and there's essentially an infinite number of degrees you point it to out of the whole spherical universe, and that's just the known universe. They claim that what we've listened to so far or screened in all the years SETI's been going on, which is probably 30 or more years, it's the equivalent of looking for life in the ocean, all the oceans of the world, and you've done only a teacup so far. That's it. So there could be, we have not ruled out intelligent life by any means. I agree with you. There's just so many, there's literally trillions of planets, trillions, and that's just in the known universe. There's got to be life. Personally, even leaving aside weird sci-fi forms of life that are not carbon-based, if there's water anywhere, and we now know there's water on asteroids and everything, so I'm sure there's billions of planets with water. Nucleic acids are going to eventually form, and it'll be some kind of replication. It might not be a double strand with 4 nucleotides, but the life will evolve something like that.
One thing we talked about before we got on the air was the benefit of lay people knowing a little bit of science. As we said, even a little bit of a minuscule foundation in physics, or just the grandeur of the universe, the scale of the universe, the history of the universe, it would give people such a great perspective on their life, maybe some humility, and it show them like, wow, this is so much bigger than I've sold myself to believe. For me, that's what excites me about learning. Like, I really like learning about astronomy and astrophysics because it gives me that perspective. And I think one conclusion that we can draw from zooming out and looking at the entire universe, it's that all life forms in this universe, let's say this Earth, they're all one thing. They're all the universe coming to life. And we see ourselves as separate because we're kind of zoomed in and looking at this like very local level, but on the grand scale, we're all the universe. What else could we be? There's nothing else we can be. There's nothing else that exists as far as we know. So for us to like meet with another civilization, I think that would be so incredible, because we're both like, okay, we are both this universe, and we've both come to life and evolved and survived and developed the technology, and now we're meeting each other. And if we can get past that initial point of that 50-50 chance of like you're going to blow yourself up or not, the possibilities for technology and just advancement and the growth of consciousness in the universe, they're just incredible, and you can't even imagine them. That for me, that there's nothing more exciting than pondering that. And I think that's really why I like learning about all sorts of things. Like for me, you gain perspective from astrophysics, biology, chemistry, the social sciences, because they're all one thing. They're all you learning about your universe and thus being able to see patterns in it and see further. And it's like you're building your own telescope with the knowledge you gain.
I fully agree. And yeah, we talked about that before we went on the air. I'd like your audience to appreciate what you just said, because I'm like that too. It's part of the unfocused thing, but in this way, it's a good thing. Many of my colleagues they've stopped subscribing to general journals like Nature and Science. They do everything online. I still like the print journals because I can browse through them and see some physics articles that I may not understand, but I feel as a scientist, I should know more than just the science of genetics. I should know the rest of biology, at least a little bit. I won't be an expert. And I should know chemistry, sociology, psychology. Unfortunately, many people now, because there's so much happening in just your own little field, they barely keep up with that. So, they set PubMed, the searchable, journal article database for just the keyword of what they work on, whatever their disease is. So they'll never see the stuff I stumble on in the print journal, which gives me a certain, if it's a little bit of superficial knowledge, I'm nowhere near a physicist, but I feel it gives me a type of wisdom that you have too, of the bigger picture. And like you said, so many of our public, because of bad educational systems, have such a narrow view, and it affects their politics, I'm sorry to say. Before we went on the air, I bemoaned that most people don't even know the scientific method, being skeptical, disproving a hypothesis, which to me goes way beyond science. You should also use that in politics, deciding who you're going to vote for. Is what they're saying making any sense, or is it all just total made up garbage? And I don't think many people are critical thinkers anymore. Like you, my greatest wish has always been that before I die, we will make contact with some advanced civilization. I mean, I'll be thrilled at this point if even the new rover, what is it, Perseverance, finds some microbes on Mars. That alone will be wonderful. I actually think it's going to, maybe even alive now, because there's no reason Mars shouldn't have had some evolution of life. But to actually meet an intelligent civilization, especially more advanced than ours, especially based on the assumption you said, which if I can put it into different words, and this may not be true, we hope it's true, that with greater technology comes greater wisdom. I hope that's true. It doesn't always. It's not like that in the Star Wars movie universe. When the movie Close Encounters came out, that was the first science fiction movie in my experience where the aliens were friendly, wanted to meet us and work with us, instead of just destroying everything. And I actually wrote a fan letter to Steven Spielberg. This was in 1977, saying what you said, that this was my greatest wish in life, and that your movie portrayed it in a way I had never seen before. And I actually got an answer back from him, signed, that I've now got, keeping very safe. So that's always been a dream of mine. As I've gotten older and learned more about the scale of the universe, I've become more and more pessimistic. It's not just the distances and the limitation of the speed of light. It's the time scales. If an intelligent civilization had looked at the Earth a million years ago, they would have found nothing. I mean, they would have found some animals and plants, but no sign of intelligence, and they might have just gone away. Carl Sagan also showed a little thing, the whole 3 billion year of history of the Earth, or whatever it is, 4.5 billion. The time that human civilization has been there is this tiny little sliver at the very end. So if you just deal with random probability of when we were contacted, there's like a 99.99999, et cetera, probability that they would have contacted us at some time prior to now, before they blew themselves up or before we were here. So I've sort of given up that wish. I think I'll be happy if we just find evidence of microbial life on Mars. That'll be great. But my hope is that if we did meet someone advanced, they would have a greater wisdom than us and maybe could advise us to avoid how they were able to avoid blowing themselves up. Maybe there's a way we haven't thought of yet. This has great impact on religion too. Many highly religious people won't like this prospect. And in fact, in Sagan's book and movie Cosmos, it was some religious fundamentalists who were against when they got a signal from Vega or wherever it was, they didn't want to hear that, because to them, the earth is the universe. That's it. This is what God created. We're the only intelligent life. So it, like you said, it would have a huge impact on philosophy. But there's also the assumption that they will be wise and kind, which I don't know if we can always assume. Like us, they would have evolved from animals with all the aggressiveness we have, and maybe they found a way to get over that, maybe not. There's some speculation, a whole other reason about the so-called eerie silence of the universe. Why have there been no signals? Why have we never been contacted? One theory is there are lots of other intelligent life out there, but they want to keep a real low profile. They don't want their position in the universe known because they're afraid some aggressive, much more advanced civilization will be there tomorrow because they can exceed the speed of light, kill all of them, and just take their natural resources. That is a possibility too.
That is fascinating. I think you just kind of summarize what my show's about. It's you can't put it in you can't just say it's about one thing. I mean, I have trouble even deciding what this is about, but these conversations, they hint at me to continue, because I feel like what we just talked about, this vision of an entity, or not even a humanity, but like a universal life, this is, we're looking very far into the future, and that really excites me. I know that it's almost time, so is there anything that you would like to leave my audience with?
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I've done many interviews and podcasts. I have to say, Eric, I've never had one with the scope of this one, which is essentially the whole universe. And as you can tell, I like this kind of stuff. I just love it. And it's one reason, as I said, I love being at UCLA, where there's a department of physics that I can walk to in 5 minutes instead of going across the whole city. If there's anything I'd like you and I, because we do think alike, to inspire the undergrads, is keep a broadly open mind, especially now that you're undergrads. This is sort of the last chance you have to sample everything. Take all kinds of courses and, other things out. And I'm talking, outside of science. Really, the most memorable course I ever had as an undergrad at Johns Hopkins was a Shakespeare course. I never had appreciated Shakespeare in high school. This changed me. Now it's one of the great pleasures of my life, reading and seeing Shakespeare. So, and it helps your science work too. It really does. Like Eric said, the humanities and science ideally should cross-fertilize each other and lead to a greater wisdom than either one alone would have. So I think Eric is a good example of that, and I hope I am. That would be my last words of wisdom.
Amazing. Well, thank you for coming on the show, Professor. It was great to have this really engaging conversation with you. I suspect it will not be the last.
Yeah, I'd be happy to come back. This was fun.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Elder Llama podcast. This is what the show is all about. It's sitting down with the brilliant minds of the UCLA network and having conversations about a wide range of topics. The UCLA community is a hotspot of genius, and it's my intention to explore that genius and share it with you. If that sounds cool to you, consider subscribing on whatever platform you're listening to this. And if you want to interact with me, ask questions, suggest ideas, follow me on Instagram @ElderLlama.